Okay, welcome everyone to Palestine 106, Six Wars on Gaza. Thank you for being here. Before we get started, I just want to say that this is a very high-level overview because a lot of these wars could be their own teach-in. So we're going to, there's naturally going to be some gaps in information, but hopefully it inspires you to look into some of the resources later. And with that, we are going to start with some important terms to know because all of these terms, they might not verbatim come up throughout the wars, but you'll notice like when I describe certain things, you'll be like, oh, that sounds like this, or this sounds like that. So kind of try to pay attention for them. So our first term is the Dahia Doctrine, which is disproportionate force used to cause massive destruction to the civilian population. In 2006, Israel deliberately attacked known civilian targets in Dahi, a suburb in Beirut, which is where the term Dahia Doctrine came from. And I'm just going to read this excerpt for you. The Dahia Doctrine is named after the Dahi, a suburb of Beirut. During Israel's war with Lebanon in 2006, known civilian targets in Dahi were deliberately and widely attacked by the Israeli military, virtually wiping out the entire neighborhood. An Israeli general, Gadi Eisenkot, told an Israeli newspaper 2 years later, "What happened in the Dahia quarter of Beirut in 2006 will happen in every village from which Israel is fired on. We will apply disproportionate force on it and cause great damage and destruction there. From our standpoint, these are not civilian villages, they are military bases. This is not a recommendation, this is a plan, and it has been approved." The plan, as Eisenkot put it, was to respond to any attack with intentionally disproportionate violence, not to necessarily defeat the attackers, but to punish the entire population through the deliberate killing of civilians and destruction of civilian infrastructure. So our next term, deterrence capacity, builds on that. And this is the use of fear to prevent resistance. Also like the Arab world's fear of Israel. And the Dahia Doctrine is often used to accomplish that. So they're trying to make any surrounding countries afraid enough that they won't even try to resist. And our next term, Hannibal Directive, is a policy that directs the use of maximum force to prevent kidnapping, including death. Haaretz, which is basically like Israel's New York Times, found that that directive was used by Israel on their own people on October 7th. And this directive is also used if a high-ranking military official is captured because they're trying to avoid prisoner and hostage exchanges. So it's easier just to kill them. And so then there's no one that they have to try to bargain for. The next term, human shield, this one's kind of self-explanatory. It is a person or group used to deter an attack. Human rights orgs regularly find that Hamas does not use human shields, however, Israel does. So as an aside here, when you hear things like every accusation is a confession, you'll often hear Israel accuse Hamas of using human shields, for example, and you look through a lot of the human rights reports that follow a lot of these operations. It's not Hamas that uses them, it's Israel. Maximum land and minimum Palestinians. So Palestinians are considered a demographic threat by Israel because they're trying to achieve a Jewish majority. So they try to expand the territory for Jewish Israelis by eliminating Palestinians and concentrating, either killing Palestinians or concentrating the rest into little tiny enclaves. This year alone, Israel has stolen 5 square miles in the West Bank, the largest land grab in 3 decades. So while we are focused on Gaza for obvious reasons, they're also making egregious moves in the West Bank. Our next term, mowing the lawn. This is killing and destroying as much as possible to prevent Palestinians from living and flourishing, also known as operations, 6 of which we will go over today. Our next term, perfect victims. The prerequisites Western minds often require to show sympathy or empathy to a victim. And Mohammed El-Kurd had a good article out in this quote. He says, There are prerequisites these victims must meet. They're often women, children, the elderly. They carry US or European passports and perform humane professions or have disabilities. Everyone will tell you they would never hurt a fly, and even if they were once wolves, they are now docile and defanged, only howling at the moon in agony. They never charge, attack, or hunt in a pack. Their campaigning is individualistic, centered only on their personal tragedies, incentivized by humanitarian need rather than political ideology. And then the final term, shrinking civilian, the shrinking scope of who is considered civilian and therefore protected from attack. So the racialization of Palestinians as inherently dangerous or terrorists leads to them being presumed as always guilty. And Nora Erakat in her book Justice for Some talks a lot about how Israel has manipulated the law to shrink who is considered a civilian. So as Israel tries to say that everyone is Hamas, a lot of people don't realize that Hamas has both a military and a civil branch. And so by conflating Hamas as terrorists, everything associated with Hamas as terrorists, so that means that even people like teachers and civilian police officers, government workers, are suddenly considered terrorists and no longer civilians simply because they're employed through Hamas, which is pretty much impossible to avoid in Gaza. So now that we've covered some important terms, these are the operations we will be covering today. And just take a second to look at how many of them there are in that short of a time frame. And also, as we're talking about this, remember that Gaza is under siege. Israel controls everything that goes in and comes out. So a lot of times after these operations, they will tighten the siege to further restrict things like building supplies, steel, concrete, things you need to repair what they damaged or destroyed. So our first operation, Pass-Led, was 22 days. It was the 27th of December 2008 through the 18th of January 2009. About 1,400 Palestinians were killed, 350 which were children. Up to 4/5 of that number were civilians, and about 5,300 were injured. On the Israeli side, 13 deaths, 10 were combatants, 3 civilian, about 518 injuries. The damage in those 22 days, over 3,000 homes and hundreds of other properties were destroyed and over 20,000 were damaged. And then also keep in mind, damaged could also mean that there is a severe reduction or complete cessation of whatever services. So if they damaged a medical facility, that could very well mean that they might be able to repair that building, but the services they were providing to people, they're either restricted or just can't do it. So this is a map, a satellite image of the damages from Pass-Led, and the big block text is just what was blown up from the upper corner. And the important part is a sentence at the end, and it says, "It is highly probable, therefore, that the damages identified in this map underestimate the actual building and infrastructure damages present on the ground at the time of satellite image acquisition." So you look at this map, and that is a significant amount of damage, and then to realize that this is an underestimate of how much damage occurred. And this strip is less than a marathon long. It is 25 miles long. So the background to Pass-Led, what led up to this, in June of 2008, Hamas and Israel entered a ceasefire negotiated by Egypt. Oh, yes. Thank you. Hamas was careful to maintain the ceasefire despite Israel not relaxing the siege, which was their end of the deal, but often they don't keep their end of the deal. On the 4th of November, Israel broke the ceasefire by carrying out a lethal border raid on Gaza, killing 6 Palestinian militants, claiming it was to preempt a Hamas raid. That is something you hear frequently throughout these operations. We hear it now. Everything is about defending against Hamas. And in December, Israel launched a guided missile at police cadets and their families at graduation. Within minutes, they also targeted Hamas police and security forces across the entire enclave, resulting in 200 deaths. And as we noted earlier, the police cadets and Hamas police officers are civilian law enforcement personnel and therefore not legitimate military targets. They are civilian, not combatants. In addition to that, they also launched an aerial blitz combined with a ground assault and piloting the most advanced combat aircraft in the world. The Israeli Air Force flew nearly 3,000 sorties over Gaza and dropped 1,000 tons of explosives, while the Israeli army deployed several brigades equipped with sophisticated intelligence gathering systems and weaponry such as robotic and TV-aided remote-controlled guns. On the other side, Hamas launched several hundred rudimentary rockets and mortar shells into Israel. So what got me about this was the remote-controlled guns, because there is an organization breaking the silence. It's former IDF soldiers and their testimonies of what they had to do or forced to do. And some of the testimonies, and some of them are in Finkelstein's book, talk about how they felt like they were playing a video game. They're not really engaged in combat. They're sitting back and taking lives, and there's no, literally no consequence to them. And as Finkelstein noted, then and now, the objective was to provoke retaliation and thus provide the pretext for a massive assault. The outcome: on the 18th of January, Israel declared a unilateral ceasefire at the request of Barack Obama. So do you think what's happening around that time that Obama would be like, hey, it's not a good look for you to be bombing the hell out of a place? Getting ready to become president, so he can't have one of the US's big allies doing these horrible massacres. So needed Israel to knock it off. In April, the president of the UN Human Rights Council appointed a fact-finding mission to investigate all violations of international human rights law and international humanitarian law during Operation Cast Lead. Richard Goldstone, who was a Jewish Zionist, was selected to lead the mission. So you would think that a Jewish Zionist being selected would be totally bulletproof. And yet, Israel refused to cooperate, saying the mission was biased. Surprised they didn't say it was anti-Semitic. In September of 2009, the Goldstone report was released. And the Goldstone report found that much of the devastation Israel inflicted during Cast Lead was premeditated. It also found that the operation was anchored in a military doctrine that views disproportionate destruction and creating maximum disruption in the lives of as many people as a legitimate means to achieve military and political goals, and that it was designed to have inevitably dire consequences for the non-combatants in Gaza. The disproportionate destruction and violence against civilians sprang from the deliberate policy, as did the humiliation and dehumanization of the Palestinian population. Although Israel justified the attack on the grounds of self-defense against Hamas rocket attacks, the report pointed to a different motive. The primary purpose of the Israeli blockade was to bring about a situation in which a civilian population would find life so intolerable that they would leave, if that were possible, or turn Hamas out of office, as well as to collectively punish the civilian population. While Cast Lead itself was aimed at punishing the Gaza population for its resilience and for its apparent support of Hamas, and possibly with the intent of forcing a change in support. The report concluded that the Israeli assault constituted a deliberately disproportionate attack designed to punish, humiliate, and terrorize the civilian population, radically diminish its local economic capacity both to work and provide for itself, and to force upon it an ever-increasing sense of dependency and vulnerability. It also paid tribute to the resilience and dignity of the Gazan people in the face of dire circumstances. So the Goldstone report did not end up getting the attention it deserved. Goldstone ended up recanting, and that's a long story, also covered in Finkelstein's book. So I encourage you to read that because that's fascinating and also a little bit discouraging at that point. But also at the end of this, Amnesty and Human Rights Watch reported that the US was a major arms supplier to Israel, including white phosphorus, which is illegal to use in civilian areas. Israel's military intervention in the Gaza Strip has been equipped to a large extent by the US supplied weapons, munitions, and military equipment paid for with US taxpayers' money. And if you're not familiar with white phosphorus, like I said, it's illegal to be used where civilians are. It is a wax-like substance that burns at over 800 degrees Celsius, which is 1500 degrees Fahrenheit. It's hot enough to melt metal. It can burn down to the bone, and it can reignite if it comes into contact with more skin, which is part of why it is so difficult to treat. And with that, we move into our next operation, Operation Pillar of Defense, also known as Operation Pillar of Cloud. This is 8 days. It's the 14th through the 21st of November. 167 Palestinians were killed, 32 were children, 87 civilians. 80% of that total number were killed in the last 4 days, about 1,000 injuries. On the Israeli side, 6 deaths, 4 were civilians, about 239 injuries. The damage in Gaza, at least 382 homes and many other properties were partially or completely destroyed. 240 educational facilities were damaged, 25 schools sustained major damage, 13 primary healthcare centers sustained minor damage, 2 bridges were severely damaged, several media offices were attacked, and Gaza was hit with 1,000 tons of explosives. On the other side, Israel was hit with a single ton. The lead up to this, on the 14th of November, the Israeli Air Force killed Ahmed al-Jabari, the head of the military branch of Hamas in Gaza, and a passenger, Mohammed al-Hams. Jabari had been in the process of advancing a permanent ceasefire when he was killed. Does that sound familiar to anything that's happened recently? Yes, Ismail Haniyeh, also in the process of advancing a permanent ceasefire, recently just assassinated. Defense Minister Ehud Barak claimed Israel was only reacting to Hamas rockets being fired into Israel, but the numbers would maybe suggest otherwise. Between the 1st of January and the 11th of November, 1 Israeli was killed by attacks from Gaza, whereas 78 Palestinians were killed by attacks from Israel. So, decide for yourself if that seems like who was defending against what. And at one level, Israel was transparent in its motive. It kept repeating that it wanted to restore its deterrence capacity. The outcome of this pillar of defense was not as destructive as Cass led for a few reasons. One, obviously, it was shorter, but the other details, the Egyptian prime minister and Turkish foreign minister both traveled to Gaza during the assault, and both countries had drawn a red line at a ground assault, saying they wouldn't tolerate a repeat of Cass led. The Goldstone report made them nervous they could actually face legal accountability. So while some things went on behind the scenes and Goldstone recanted, still made Israel nervous because that was the first time they got that close to being held accountable. And also this time foreign journalists were able to enter Gaza, unlike during Cass led. During the last 4 days, Israel reverted to indiscriminately firing on civilians and targeting journalists, though. So at some point, they just couldn't contain themselves any longer and went about their usual MO of targeting journalists and everyone. Israel called on the US to negotiate a ceasefire to bail them out of their predicament because they could not subdue Hamas without a ground invasion, but they also couldn't launch a ground invasion because of the above factors. So Egypt brokered a mutual ceasefire, which was a shift from previous times. And this included Israel agreeing to lift the siege and omitted the precondition of Hamas stopping smuggling or making weapons. Normally, they condition any lifting of a siege with Hamas disarming. Israel hoped that the US would negotiate better terms for them, which was kind of why they weren't as nitpicky about the terms. But at the time, Obama was working to improve relations with Egypt, so he didn't side with Israel the way they were hoping for. This ceasefire was celebrated by Palestinians and embarrassing to Israel's government, but some Israelis still tried to claim it was successful because they don't want to admit when they lost or were embarrassed. So our third operation, Operation Protective Edge, was 51 days long from the 8th of July to the 26th of August. 2,251 Palestinians were killed, 551 were children, 1,462 were civilians, 11,231 were injured. On the Israeli side, about 73 deaths, 6 were civilian, about 720 injuries. In Gaza, they destroyed 18,000 homes, destroyed or damaged 17 hospitals and 56 primary healthcare centers, destroyed or damaged 45 ambulances, destroyed 22 schools and damaged 118 others, destroyed 73 mosques and damaged 130 others, created 2.5 million tons of rubble during Protective Edge. And for reference, they created 600,000 tons of rubble during Cast Lead. And they repeatedly attacked Gaza's only power plant. And then this is just an image from that time of one of the areas that had been bombed. So leading up to Protective Edge in April, Hamas and its rival Fatah formed a consensus government, which was cautiously welcomed by the US and the EU. This granted Hamas unprecedented legitimacy, but with a concession of recognizing Israel, renouncing violence, and recognizing past agreements. Palestinian unity was a red line for Netanyahu because his argument for not negotiating was that he couldn't negotiate with a divided Palestine, but you'll also see throughout history a lot of cases where he intentionally creates divisions to continue promoting this narrative. In June, 3 Israeli teens were abducted and killed by a rogue group. Netanyahu and the government knew pretty quickly that Hamas's leadership had nothing to do with the teens' death, but they hid this because they wanted an excuse to launch another operation. So we hid the facts and launched Operation Brother's Keeper. And they did that, and it was meant to elicit a response from Hamas because they were trying to get Hamas to react and prove that they were indeed terrorists. Hamas usually tries really hard to not engage. And after the teen's death, Israeli settlers retaliated, did a lot of awful things, including brutalizing a young teen named Mohammed. They broke his bones, forced him to drink gasoline, and set him on fire and killed him. On the 14th of July, Egypt proposed a ceasefire that required Hamas to stop firing and Israel to ease the siege. Hamas rejected this due to Israel refusing to ease the siege unless they disarmed. And so I think some people would think, well, why won't they just do that? That sounds like a fine agreement. But again, if you look through history, especially I think a pretty poignant example would be Lebanon in 82, when they basically got the PLO to withdraw. And then there was supposed to be like these multinational militaries or whatever there to protect civilians, but they withdrew early and Israel went in and massacred Sabra and Shantia. That's a worthwhile event to look into. But that's also one of the many reasons that Hamas won't just disarm on the promise that Israel will keep up their end of a deal. On the 17th of July, a Malaysian airliner was downed over Ukraine. And while this isn't directly related to Palestine, what it did was it distracted the world's attention from what was going on. So those last two factors gave Netanyahu the environment he needed to launch his brutal ground assault. On the 26th of August, a ceasefire went into effect. Netanyahu claimed it was a great military and political achievement. But as we said earlier, sometimes they claim that they were successful, but Israel did not actually achieve any of its goals. The Palestinian consensus government held. They did not show Hamas as terrorists. They instead showed themselves as one, and they did not destroy Hamas, their rockets, or their tunnels. Also, if you take out all these dates, you probably think we're talking about right now. An Amnesty International report found that the Hannibal Directive was used when Israel thought Second Lieutenant Hadar Golden had been captured. Israeli troops sealed off a 1.5 mile radius and fired 500 artillery shells and launched 100 airstrikes on the area over 2 days. And I believe in Nora Erakat's book, she talks about, I think they found out that he hadn't actually been captured. He died in crossfire, and they knew that, but they just kept doing what they were doing because now they're mad, and that's what they were doing. Yeah, right. And a UN report found the latest military operation has effectively eliminated what was left of the middle class, sending almost all the population into destitution and dependence on international humanitarian aid. 9 months later, not a single destroyed home had been rebuilt. So again, remember, Gaza's under siege. Getting enough equipment, machines, supplies to rebuild is incredibly difficult, especially when the small area you live in is continuously bombed and destroyed. And a poll revealed half of Gazans wanted to leave. Some drowned trying to escape, and that's an exceptional case, but it did happen. And an unprecedented number died by suicide. And I put this in here because while we talk about Palestinian steadfastness, or samud in Arabic, and their resilience and resistance, I think it's important to remember they're also, like, they're humans. I think a lot of times BIPOC groups, people think that they're just really strong and not as susceptible to pain as their lighter skinned counterparts, and that's just simply not true. If anyone loses someone or something dear to them, it hurts the same regardless of your skin color. And Peter Maurer, president of the International Committee of the Red Cross, said, quote, "I've never seen such massive destruction ever before," and this coming from someone whose career was going into war-torn places. Moving on to our next operation. For these last three, I had trouble finding the same amount of information for them. I'm assuming partially because they're more recent, but I figured that after the first few, where I just threw a ton of numbers at you, sometimes as humans, we get statistics fatigue, and it's hard to process just all the information, and especially human brains have trouble with bigger numbers. I think it said our brains think anything over 6 is a big number. So there's information out there on that, and that's really interesting, but that's a whole other topic. So I thought that this would be a good time to break it up with a personal testimony. So Operation Guardian of the Walls was 11 days, the 10th through the 21st of May, 2021. 232 Palestinians were killed, 54 were children, 137 civilians, 1,948 were injured. On the Israeli side, there were 7 deaths. If there were injuries, I could not find them. Destroyed 1,700 homes and partially demolished at least 14,300 other units. So as I said, I was breaking this up with a personal testimony. The first few times I read this, I cried. So we'll see if I can get through it without crying this time. And this is the testimony of Muna Aman. On May 13th, 2021, at around 11 p.m., I woke up suddenly in complete darkness. There was debris, dust, and smoke all around me. I couldn't see anything. I felt terrible pain all over my body, and it felt like things were piercing it. I also felt burns on my body and face. The pain was so strong, I screamed. Suddenly, one of my daughters came, I don't know which one, and pulled me out. Just then, I heard another missile and lost sight of her. The place filled with smoke and dust. Then the paramedics came. I asked them to look for my daughters. They told me they'd take care of me first and then look for them. I lost consciousness and woke up the next morning at the ICU. I asked my relatives about my children, and they said they were all right. A few days later, the doctors moved me to the orthopedic department, where I was told my husband, Muhammad, had been killed. I went into shock and cried. A few minutes later, I was told that 3 of my daughters had also been killed, Hadil, Warda, and Wala. I went into shock. They were my hope my whole life, especially Hadil, who was the most spoiled and was very attached to me. It was a shock for me. I never thought anything like that would happen to me. I don't know how to go on living. And so I think the important part to remember too is this is one story. This is one testimony out of hundreds of this operation and hundreds of thousands over the decades. So when you hear those big numbers, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, each singular number is a story like this, full of heartbreak and grief and loss. And it's no less intense because of them being Palestinian. It is the same because we are all humans. Our next operation, Operation Breaking Dawn, was 3 days long. It was the 5th through the 7th of August. 49 Palestinians were killed, 17 were children, 360 were injured. There were no Israeli deaths and 31 injuries. And again, I had trouble finding the same sorts of information. So instead of damage, I focused on what they targeted during this operation. So look at the slide and kind of focus on what the words I bolded and see if you can notice any patterns there. And then tell me like what you notice about that. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yep. Yeah. Yeah. It's all residential areas. There's no legitimate target really there. And these are maps of the areas they targeted each day and the deaths on each day. So the background leading up to this, on the 1st of August, Israel closed off its borders in order to further cripple Gaza's economy, especially the power sector. And as we said before, they only have one power plant. The only power plant was the first to sound the alarm that they were unable to provide power due to the increased shortage of fuel. On the 5th of August, Israel launched Operation Breaking Dawn, claiming they were targeting high-level military officials in the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. But what did we just talk about? What did they target? All neighborhoods and residential areas. So Israel targeted primarily residential areas. Many PIJ members were not engaged in combat when they were targeted, making them non-combatants. They were at home with their families. So even if they were combatants at that time, being at home with your family, and also that ties back into our conversation about human shields. So then Israel would say, well, they're using human shields. But does being with your family mean that like they're instantly human shields? The outcome of this, on the 8th of August, Egypt brokered a ceasefire. And less than 10 days after the assault ended, Israel admitted that they were responsible for the deaths of 5 children. They initially tried to claim it was a PIJ misfire, kind of like how, in the beginning of the current genocide, they tried to say that Hamas misfired and accidentally hit their own hospital. Turned out that wasn't true, was it? They've now since bombed every hospital in Gaza. These children were visiting their grandfather's grave. So that cemetery that you saw on the first slide in this operation, that's who they killed. A bunch of children visiting their grandfather at the cemetery. And our final operation, this one was 5 days long, the 9th through the 13th of May. Just a few short months before the current genocide, 31 Palestinians were killed, 11 were civilian, 190 were injured. There was 1 Israeli death and 40 injuries. They destroyed 103 housing units, severely damaged 140 housing units, and damaged a total of 2,943. On the 9th of May, Israel launched airstrikes at 3 homes where members of the PIJ lived. Israel did not even try to hide that they knowingly attacked residential homes in the middle of the night. They still tried to claim it was legal despite the obvious outcome of killing civilians. They claimed the civilian deaths were collateral damage, and they claimed that PIJ were hiding among civilians, aka using human shields. So them just simply being at home. And this is also how I mentioned earlier, Israel has manipulated the law to shrink who is considered a civilian. And this quote comes from B'Tselem. B'Tselem is an Israeli human rights organization. And they said, not long ago, Israeli officials were trying to claim the moral high ground by distancing themselves from illegal acts that blatantly violate international law. Such acts were described as having a black flag of flagrant illegality that pains the eye and outrages the heart flying over them. But nowadays, Israeli decision makers no longer even bother trying to hide the fact that for them, killing innocent people, including small children, is considered legitimate, not for lack of choice, not in the face of insurmountable, immediate life-threatening danger, but as the high road, as the culmination of a reflective decision-making process, by choice, by will. So each of these operations over the years, over the decades, they managed to acquire a little more impunity, and just each time they got more egregious with their massacres and atrocities until we're at the point now where, and here's a plug for our final teaching in this series, Brian and Amy will be talking about the current genocide, and this ties in how it's been going on so long, the fact that they have managed to skirt any accountability all these decades. And our final slide. The massacre of innocent people is a serious matter. It is not a thing to be easily forgotten. It is our duty to cherish their memory. Questions, comments? John. Justice for some. Nora Erakat is a Palestinian attorney, and so I'm probably not super awesome at trying to condense what she says, but she pretty much looks at what's happened to Palestine completely through the law, or the lens of legality and law, and what Israel has done with the law to be able to continue doing what they do. So this is definitely a good read and worth checking out, especially as we talk about like the ICC and ICJ and their roles. And she talks a lot, maybe not, I can't remember it's in here or some of her interviews, just about how it's important to not rely on the law to deliver or save or bring justice, but it is a tool and we have to use it. So don't say, oh, well, those institutions never save us. You're right, they don't save us, but they're still a tool at our disposal. And if we use them wisely, they can help advance our causes. Yes.
You may have already said this, but where is the starting point for the 6 months that coverage? Like, is it when the Israeli military formed? Because, like, obviously, before then, they had their militias and dynasties that were attacking stuff. Not science, but where did you start? How did you start from? What was the starting?
That was actually, Sundas, do you have it?
Actually, it was you. And it was for Gaza. So Gaza being under siege has only been the last 15 years. So that's why we're looking at the last 15 years. So these are operations against Gaza specifically. So operations that were public knowledge, basically. Operations that they had a very specific goal, even if that's not what they, I mean, their public goal versus what they actually did is very different. But all of those operations happen after the process was kind of seen. So all the terrorism and torture and kidnapping, massacring of Palestinians across Palestine before the siege is not included in this, because this focuses specifically on Gaza. The guys scored the last teaching, which is about Gaza.
Yeah.
And then, one more question.
Yeah. Wait, what means?
Siege. Like,
Siege.
what does that mean for the US?
It means that Israel controls the air, land, water, the civil registry. They control everything. Import, export. So that is also why, while some people say, oh, well, they're not occupied anymore, Israel withdrew in 2005. International law, every other non-Western country pretty much understands that they are still technically under occupation, even though there's not Israeli settlers physically in Gaza.
Think about something as like pilot joy. It has to be approved by Israel to go into Gaza. So Gazans don't have access to making choices about the birds. They, get inside or outside of Gaza. They can't go in and out of Gaza at ease. They have to be very, very lucky to win very specific scholarships from international organizations to send them to college outside the country or wherever else. Like, it's called an open air prison because it is completely controlled by Israel. So when we talk about them setting up water and electricity, all of that controlled by Israel. One power plant is sponsored by Israel. And so they haven't had access to fuel, they haven't had access to electricity, water, so on and so forth, throughout this genocide, because Israel has complete control over the entire border. But even before this current genocide, before October 7th, there have been regularly long periods of time where Gazans only have access to electricity 4 hours a day. Can you imagine your life with access to electricity for only 4 hours of your day? You can't leave beyond. You can't leave that little strip. You can't go out of town. You can't book a hotel. Like, it's not like like we are living here in so much privilege. We take granted this AC. We take for granted these lights, how bright they are, how strong the electricity is, how strong our water pressure is. Like, every single one of these things is a hardship daily, and it has been for over a decade.
I got a question. I was reading something that said, like, what is the percentage of water that there is? I'm reading something. Things like a certain.
Well, right now it's about less than right there.
Mhm.
It's like something less than
3 liters, yeah.
And prior to that, I think prior to October 7th, 2012, it was that some 2% of Gaza's water was not drinkable. It was not safe. And they had maybe 7 liters of water per day per person, and the recommended daily is like way above that. Yeah, sure. But it's for eating, cooking, bathing.
Yeah.
And just to go back to what you were saying earlier, that I remember seeing a video of children talking about things that they're excited for or things that they want again. And this is prior to October 7th, but a child was like, I want to taste sugar. He's not even having access to like sugar as well. Something so essential. Chocolate. Yeah.
Yeah, I was about to say it's gotten worse because it's coming up to the what's the crossing? Yeah, like Green South. Yeah, so like now like a lot of suppliers being arbitrarily denied like medical supplies. They're saying no, you can't have medical. Yeah, you can't have medical supplies that you therapy. The more like you mentioned, Bonnie mentioned sugar and you mentioned chocolate, but like a lot of like items, it seems like it's like deliberately calculated just to like make it so okay, this isn't a human need, but it makes your life miserable. So like musical instruments and chocolate, just small things that bring life where they can't be accused of violating human rights, but it still makes you like musical.
Actually, even before October, Israel had a rule about how many calories can be let into Gaza at any point in time. It was just below the recommended caloric intake for a human being. So the total amount of food, literal calories that are coming into Gaza are always right below the amount that a human being needs. And that's an average human being. Just like anywhere else in the world, there are so many different types of human there are people that have severe, health issues and, extra needs that are never going to be attended to while living in Gaza. Yep, everyone.
Yeah.
Like, a lot of boys are not allowed in Gaza. Not for any good reason, but because it's a school, it's a psychological school. And that's, they have been using psychological tools of intimidation and fear for decades. Right now in Gaza, they often talk about something called the banana, which is a piece of drones that fly around nonstop 24/7 and have for the last 10+ months. And they just make really loud, like, buzzing sounds. 24/7. You cannot escape it. So it's just psychological torture. That's the only purpose of it.
There's a photo on building materials too, on lumber.
What was that?
There's a photo on building materials like lumber.
Yeah. Yeah. You only have so many things. Yeah.
Which means they can't build even though they bomb all their buildings every couple of years. So by the time they're bombing them the next time, they have to build the last building going.
Yep.
I read somewhere, there's a book by I.O. Wiseman where one of the reasons tunnel digging became such a ubiquitous strategy was because there was so much rubble in Gaza. It was extremely easy to hide any kind of dirt that you would fit underneath.
When you're talking about like caloric intake, just to bring it back to the US, because I feel like the US is complicit in everything all the time.
Yeah, we fund all of this, by the way, guys.
What? Oh, 5 minutes, is that what you said?
Good.
No, we fund all of it. Oh, we fund all of it. Oh,
Yeah, yeah.
research.
It's all of our money that's going there.
Yeah, but the study that they use to measure the caloric intake for sustaining health or sustaining weight was done by the US and Canadian governments on indigenous communities. That's how they get that information, so it never ends,
And it's also worth noting that there's only 2 countries in the entire world that don't believe food is a human right. Can we guess which 2 countries that is? Israel and the US, yeah. Only 2. Yeah.
How has the world allowed this to go on? What is the justification?
Oh, that's a big question. Actually, Finkelstein goes through a lot of how even human rights alerts have failed Palestine for pretty much since the beginning of Israel's existence. But also, I think important parts of that, aside from the human rights orgs and the government, there's a lot of manufacturing consent through media and entertainment that just kind of passively teaches or indoctrinates people into believing certain stereotypes about certain people groups. And so then as that dehumanization builds over years and decades and millennia, then it becomes kind of easy for people to make that switch of like, oh, well, they're not really human, or oh, those people are all terrorists. So that reaction that we have suddenly like gets blunted, and that's a very reductive way to encompass a lot of variables.
I can speak to that.
Yeah,
too, like,
please.
In class and shut down immediately. That manufacturing consent occurred in curriculums, it occurred in the media that we consume, and it occurred with our politics. This whole idea of this is as America, our way of making up for not doing something sooner in the Holocaust. That's kind of how it's also talked to us. When I was in middle school and high school, I was always immediately like, when I would try to say something, people would look at me in a certain way. And the thing is, Hamas was an elected government. They have a military wing, but it's a government. But the way that it's taught in class when I was in middle school, that these are terrorists. And that you just want to have a safe place to live. And the Arab country that's violent and angry until our anti-Semitic. And so that's the rhetoric that we would talk by all types of teachers growing up. So anytime I would raise my hand and be like, hey, what about Palestinians? There was this idea that they weren't really using the last topic. Like we weren't taking care of it. There was a lot of desert. I think Arabs live on the desert, which there are some Arabs who do, but like the majority of us kind of off land like somewhere else. Because, you know, Middle East is a huge region with all sorts of different, you know, climates and things like that. So people have this idea that not only do you have the right and we have to defend Israel, we have to make up for the Holocaust, we have to never let it happen again. That kind of, I want to say, fear mongering in a way, we keep people from learning what is actually going on because it's focused on defending a group of people instead of understanding where the other, what's happening to the other groups. Like, we never learned about the massacres that had to happen to Israel. Like the villages that were completely emptied out and the people that were executed in order for people to replace them. We just learned that Jews needed a home, and we found them a home, and it's right there. And so now we have to defend it at all costs against these violent neighbors who want to take it away. What we didn't learn was within the first year after Israel was created, that they took 22% more land than the UN even agreed to. And it just kept getting worse and worse. Because at the end of the day, the US is an imperialist country and we like having power. There's a lot of oil, there's a lot of resources in the Middle East. I'm sorry, this could go on forever, but like it requires a lot of people choosing not to look a little bit easier.
Sorry. Before I go, I want to first apologize for coming in late, being disruptive, and I also want to apologize for not being more interested sooner. Just a little bit that I've heard thus far, and the question that was asked, why hasn't something been done a little sooner? And now we look at news and things like that, it's a big fear. It's a big fear, so we're next. We're next. And a lot of people don't want to see that. And it's like, just to know that no one is exempt. Especially there to where that's our starting place, that's the map of seeing it all, the tell all and things like that, that could have helped us much sooner if we helped them. So I apologize from the part that I didn't play much sooner, but I thank you, sister, for inviting us. God be blessed.
Thank you.
On
On that note, we are going to wrap up here. Amy, do you have
Yes.
announcements?
Thank you, Haiku. This is, like I say every time, these teachings are labors of love. If you would like to, we're almost have all of our books sponsored for Layers of Black History, which these books will then be distributed at local community events and at tabling events. So if you'd like to sponsor a book, it's a $5 or $10 cash or Venmo donation, and then you can put your name on a little sticker and it'll go in the book and it will be distributed by Corey with Layers of Black History. And if you would like a free Palestine shirt, we have a GoFundMe of a family we're supporting in Gaza, a $25 donation to them, and one of their lovely shirts. And those of you, most of you already know, after this, we're asking that folks walk across the bridge to the silent protest of National Night Out. There's a lot of ties between policing in this country and what is happening in Gaza. And so we stand in solidarity with the liberation of all people. So this is really integral to our work as the Harrisburg Palestine Coalition. So please join us. It's just across the bridge. We're meeting on City Island. So yeah, thank you very much.